Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm delighted to welcome all of you, both in person and online, to the second day of our two-day convening, marking the 25th anniversary of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. I am Tomiko Brown-Nagin, and I have the honor of serving as dean of this remarkable institution. Let me start by extending a particular welcome to the Radcliffe College alumni who are joining us today. Thank you for being here. We're also joined by members of the Dean's Advisory Council, the Schlesinger Library Council, and Radcliffe's Faculty Advisory Council. I'm grateful for your dedication and support, and I'm happy to celebrate with you today. I'm also glad to welcome all of the Harvard faculty, students, staff, and Radcliffe Fellows, past and present, who are joining us today. Welcome. We are so glad you're here. We began our celebration yesterday with a keynote conversation moderated by President Alan Garber with former Radcliffe Fellows and Nobel laureates Claudia Goldin and Oliver Hart. I also had the honor of recognizing Harvard President Emeritus Neil Rudenstine with a special medal for his leadership in establishing today's Radcliffe Institute, and we heard reflections from Radcliffe's founding dean and Harvard President Emerita Drew Gilpin-Faust. It was a fantastic program, and if you were unable to join, please look out for a video recording of the keynote that will be available on our website in the coming weeks. We're continuing the festivities today with a wide-ranging program featuring numerous former and current Radcliffe Fellows. We'll begin with a session on communicating across disciplines, followed by a reading by the renowned poet Tracy K. Smith, who is a Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor here at Radcliffe and Professor of English and of African and African American Studies in Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. We'll then conclude with a series of lightning talks from former and current Radcliffe Fellows who are experts on topics that are very much of the moment, including artificial intelligence, climate change, gender, and many others. These lightning talks will conclude today's formal program, but if you're here in person, I invite you to join us afterwards in Fay House for a community reception, where we'll have the chance to meet with students and learn about their engagement with Radcliffe. Let me take this opportunity to thank these students and all of today's speakers for sharing their insights and expertise with us. I also want to thank our generous friends and supporters who make programs like these, all of Radcliffe's work, in fact, possible. And finally, thank you to everyone who are joining us today for being a part of the Radcliffe community. Now, because today's convening highlights our fellowship program and student opportunities, I want to take a moment to reflect on these central and interconnected aspects of Radcliffe's work. First, our fellowship program. As I shared at yesterday's keynote, the fellowship, and indeed the broader Radcliffe Institute, is informed by the legacy of Radcliffe College, an institution founded in the late 19th century to give women access to a Harvard education at a time when they were barred from the university. We believe that since its inception, Radcliffe has challenged not only traditional definitions and disciplinarity boundaries, but also the very ideas of who and what belongs in higher education. The fellowship program evolved from Radcliffe College's Institute for Independent Study, later renamed the Bunting Institute, and the unique opportunities it afforded generations of women artists and scholars. Today's fellowship program welcomes 50 exceptional individuals to Radcliffe each year and provides them with protected time and space to pursue bold projects that advance knowledge and understanding. Over our first quarter century, The Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study has supported nearly 1,200 fellows who have joined us from 44 states, 352 cities, and 60 countries, representing 6 continents. Program alumni now include 3 Nobel laureates, 23 MacArthur Genius Grant recipients, and as of this year, a Templeton Prize laureate, among many other prestigious honors. True to Radcliffe's interdisciplinary mission, fellows represent a broad range of scholarly, professional, and creative fields. They come to Radcliffe from different types of institutions and at various stages of their careers. Pulitzer Prize recipients and National Book Award winners work alongside promising artists and scholars in the early stages of their careers. Filmmakers, visual artists, musicians, and novelists exchange ideas with historians, biologists, physicists, social scientists, physicians, lawyers, and more. The results, as you'll see in just a few moments, are remarkable. But the Radcliffe Fellowship is about more than discoveries made or books written. It is about community, both within the fellowship and across Harvard. Our fellows bring their experiences and their excellence to our campus, enriching the creative and intellectual life of the university and all who engage with it. Harvard professors become fellows themselves, as I did before I became dean, and they find new collaborators and colleagues. For Harvard students, the fellowship program offers unparalleled opportunities for development. Each year, the program supports several Harvard graduate student fellows completing their dissertations, a continuing link to the Radcliffe Graduate School that awarded master's and doctoral degrees to women through the early 1960s, when they were finally permitted to matriculate to Harvard's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and through the extraordinary Radcliffe Research Partnership Program, some 100 undergraduates are paired with Radcliffe Fellows every year for mentorship and deep research experience. Which brings me to the second highlight of the day, student engagement at Radcliffe. Radcliffe is committed to fostering the excellence and creativity of students across Harvard and beyond. In addition to opportunities in the fellowship program, Radcliffe is home to first-year seminars and immersive courses that draw upon the unparalleled holdings of the Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America. Through our grant program, students are able to develop their own creative research and service projects. We even draw on students for their input and guidance in developing our student-focused programming and other opportunities. Students also engage with Radcliffe through our Emerging Leaders program, which pairs Harvard undergraduates with local high school students in a mentoring relationship. Together, they expand limited notions of leadership and build critical research skills through the Schlesinger archives and drive social change. Drawing on Radcliffe's history and the collections in the Schlesinger, mentees are encouraged to explore the lives of earlier change makers. Now, these highlights provide only a glimpse of what students find at Radcliffe. We know that we are providing bespoke experiences unavailable elsewhere at Harvard that deepen students' educational opportunities. We believe that Radcliffe is deeply meaningful to young people, eager to sharpen their intellectual and creative talents because their feedback is impassioned. And let me share some of it with you. An Emerging Leaders undergraduate mentor remarked, "I haven't met a single person that became involved with Radcliffe and regretted it. The time I spend with the Emerging Leaders community is so full of laughter and joy, I often forget I'm working." Another student asked, where else can an extension student, a college student, a law student, and a medical student sit together and discuss ways to improve the lives of our fellow classmates and brainstorm on how to use our multifaceted areas of expertise to create innovations that impact the world around us? We are student leaders on a mission. And finally, a student who served as an Emerging Leaders mentor and a Radcliffe research partner observed, Radcliffe provides a unique space to have challenging conversations on the world's most pressing issues. As dean, I'm very proud of the opportunities Radcliffe provides to students and of our broader work that their experiences reflect. Here at Radcliffe, we foster reasoned and rigorous exchange on the critical issues of our time. And in doing so, we pursue deeper understanding and empowering new knowledge. In celebration of the Radcliffe Institute and the incredible results of our approach, I'm pleased to share a very short film honoring our anniversary and looking towards the future. Enjoy. "25 years ago, Radcliffe underwent a radical transformation, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study was born. Interdisciplinary by design and animated by a legacy of inclusion, the Radcliffe that we celebrate today is inseparable from the remarkable legacy of Radcliffe College, a school founded to ensure that the standard of education embodied in Harvard was accessible to women. As we often say, Radcliffe's bequest to Harvard was never simply about coeducation. It was and is the firm belief that universities are always greater when they draw wisdom and talent from the widest possible pool. This conviction has driven Radcliffe's success, and it is the foundation on which we will build our future. We bring scholars, students, writers, artists, and others to engage around issues that can only be fully understood by drawing on insight from across disciplines. We celebrate intellectual diversity and engage in difficult conversations. We are united in our conviction that open exchange can reveal powerful new insights. Indeed, we recognize that this is the very project of higher education. Academic excellence demands fearless inquiry. By fostering inquiry across traditional boundaries, we ignite creativity and drive innovation. It is this environment that gives rise to what we call Radcliffe moments. Life-changing convergences, unexpected discoveries, and previously unimagined collaborations characterized by an almost magical breach of disciplinary and academic divisions. These collaborative advances inspire the work and careers of our fellows, students, faculty, and researchers, push the boundaries of science, fuel research, yield great art, and have wider and longer impact than a single project or fellowship year. We mark our 25th anniversary at a challenging time in higher education, but I have every reason for hope, real hope. The mission of universities is to educate and advance human thought. And after just 25 years, the Institute has demonstrated that embracing rigorous inquiry produces unimaginable gains. Radcliffe's work, our storied fellowship program, the vast collections of the Schlesinger Library, and our vibrant community of researchers and students fuels advances that are greater than the achievement of singular individuals of remarkable talent. Our first quarter century has shown that transcending differences and breaching disciplinary boundaries can yield a form of alchemy. This current moment is an opportunity, and from this, our future unfolds. We invite you to join us. Fantastic, thank you. Now we'll begin our first session on communicating across disciplines, which will be moderated by Claire Massoud. Claire is the Joseph Bay and Janice Lee Senior Lecturer on Fiction in Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and she was a fellow here at Radcliffe in 2005. She is the best-selling author of numerous books, including the acclaimed novel, The Emperor's Children, and her most recent work, This Strange Eventful History, which was longlisted for the 2024 Booker and Giller Prizes. In addition to her Radcliffe Fellowship, Claire is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and her honors include the Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Claire will introduce all of our panelists in a few minutes, so let me express my gratitude to her and to all of our esteemed guests for joining us today. Thank you. Now, please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
It's a trick. It's a trick. I've got to go to the end. We didn't choreograph beforehand. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Dean Brown-Nagin, and everyone for being here. And it is, for me, I'm Claire Massoud, and it is a real thrill for me to be here today with these amazing fellows from different eras. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction, and then we will converse. I wanted to make sure that you know that, because I'm going to forget to say it later if I don't say it now, that you guys are all welcome to submit questions anytime during the session, and we'll get to as many as we can. Whether you're here in person or watching online, you can submit questions using the Slido link that is provided on the screen behind me and posted in the chat of the Zoom. So our panel is entitled "How Writing and Art Stir Public Imagination, Communicating Across Disciplines at Radcliffe." And I just wanted to mention that when I came to Radcliffe in 2004-05, that academic year, I was working on the novel that became The Emperor's Children, which was published in 2006. I had two small children at home, really quite small. My younger child was about 18 months, and I was writing in very short chapters because I had very, very short bursts of time, and it's sort of I can't express what that year meant to me. I'm a little verklempt. It really was transformative and such an amazing gift in my life, both for the ability to work, to have an office and a protected space, but also to have a community. As Dean Brown-Nagin was saying, the community was incredible. And one of the things that happened for me in that year was on the first day, I'm not very extroverted, and I met this very extroverted, tall person who named Melissa Franklin, who's a professor of physics here at the university. And we became very good friends. And she's a particle physicist, and I'm a novelist, and I never took calculus. Okay, so I actually have a little magnet on my fridge at home that says, "Another day that I haven't needed calculus." So it was in some ways an unlikely friendship, and I just wanted to mention that the sort of 20 years later, the fruit of that friendship is that last year and again this year, we are teaching an open enrollment creative writing class that is cross-listed in both physics and the English department, that is called Thinking Through Writing, Science Themes. And it's an intensive, it's about time, and it's an intensive writing class where students write 4 times a week, and we explore science themes without using equations. And it's the first course in the history of the university to be cross-listed in physics and English, and to satisfy requirements, distribution requirements in both the humanities and the sciences. So that's Radcliffe. Oh, and I'm eating up my time. I'm sorry, I got a little carried away. Okay, so here's who we have here. This amazing group of panelists. We have Dr. Francine Berman, who is the director of Public Interest Technology and the Stuart Rice Honorary Research Professor in the College of Information and Computer Sciences at UMass Amherst. She's also faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. Among many awards and accolades, in 2015, she was nominated by President Obama and confirmed by the U.S. Senate to become a member of the National Council on the Humanities, and in 2024 was given the Pioneer in Tech Award by the National Center for Women in Technology. A public interest technologist and data scientist, she was a 2020 Radcliffe Fellow. Welcome, Fran. Kaitlyn Greenidge is the author of the novels Libertie and We Love You, Charlie Freeman, which won the 2017 Whiting Award for Fiction and was chosen as one of the New York Times Critics' Top 10 Books of 2016. A recipient of grants from the NEA, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton, she's also features director at Harper's Bazaar and was a 2019 Radcliffe Fellow. Welcome, Kaitlyn. Now I'm a little out of order here. Okay, Sharon Weinberger is a journalist and national security and foreign policy editor at Wall Street Journal. She's held fellowships at the Radcliffe Institute, at MIT's Knight Science Journalism Program, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the International Reporting Project at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. She's written widely on military science and technology for newspapers and journals, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, New York Magazine, the Financial Times, Wired Magazine, Nature, and the BBC, and that's not all. Her third book, The Imagineers of War, the untold story of DARPA, the Pentagon agency that changed the world, and she was a 2016 Radcliffe Fellow. Welcome, Sharon. Clarissa Tossin. Clarissa is an internationally acclaimed interdisciplinary artist based in Los Angeles, originally from Brazil, who was in residence as a 2018 Radcliffe Fellow. Her work has been exhibited at major museums around the world and in the US, including most recently at the 2024 Whitney Biennial, the Image Center in Toronto, Canada, the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, and the Art Institute of Chicago. She's built a collaborative research-focused practice that uses video, installation, and sculpture. In 2019, her exhibition, Future Fossil, debuted here at Radcliffe. Welcome, Chris. And last, but by no means least, Imani Perry is a scholar of law, literature, and cultural studies and an author of creative nonfiction. She is the Carol K. Pforzheimer Professor here at Radcliffe and the Henry A. Morss Jr. and Elizabeth W. Morss Professor of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality and of African American Studies here at Harvard. A 2023 MacArthur Fellow, she's the author of 8 books, including Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, which won multiple awards. Her most recent book, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation, won the 2022 National Book Award for Nonfiction and was a New York Times bestseller. And her Radcliffe Fellowship, you're a Radcliffe professor, but I think your Radcliffe Fellowship is yet to come.
Next year.
Next year. Well, So if you want to find out more about our amazing panelists, you can find out more biographical information from the website. So I thought we might just start, guys. So I hope I would get everybody in one spot beforehand to say this. I want you all to talk to each other too. I don't want to just be the person like, I ask a question. So please feel free to respond to one another in the conversation. But I thought perhaps I might ask you first to introduce yourself in the Radcliffe context. That's to say a little about the work that brought you to Radcliffe, or in your case, perhaps the work that you intend to work upon. And when you were a fellow here, perhaps you might talk a little about what happened, whether you departed at all from your proposed path, and if so, how that came about. Fran, perhaps you'd like to start.
Okay. By the way, congratulations to all of us, and especially congratulations to Radcliffe for this amazing event and for 25 years of wonderfulness. I came to Radcliffe, I was a 2019-2020 fellow. I'm a data scientist, and I was very much interested in finding an environment to really think about the social and environmental impacts of technology. Technology surrounds us, it often bullies us and burdens us. How do we make the best of it? How do we reduce its risk to us? I was very interested in thinking about that and trying to come up with some pragmatic strategies for that. My Radcliffe application was about looking at social and environmental impacts of the Internet of Things, the connective tissue that connects our cars, our cell phones, us, everything. And I spent the year doing a really interesting deep dive into self-driving cars with many field trips in Alyssa Goodman's Tesla. And it was a really interesting year, but it was a year that was transformational in a couple of ways. First of all, my entire career, I had done a lot of different things, but there was always this focus on social impact. And it really introduced me to thinking more broadly about what I do and what I wanted to do in the future as public interest technology. So think about public interest law. It's law when you think about doing that law to promote the common good. What do we, if we do technology to promote the common good? And I pretty much pivoted from my Radcliffe experience to that space for the remainder and ongoing of my career. The second transformational thing is, I think a lot of people talk about the relationships one makes and the generosity of spirit of all your fellows. And for me, I completely enjoyed everybody in my year. I was the only computer scientist, and it was such a thrill to talk to lawyers and musicologists and art historians and mathematicians and all kinds of people who asked really provocative, kind of beginner's mind question. Why are you doing this? You know, why does anyone care? And those are really important questions. One takeaway, and then I should let other people talk. One takeaway for me from that was 4 of us, we were the first pandemic class, and so all of us left Cambridge in March, and we kept on by Zoom, and 4 of us were in a writing group, and we have books coming out of that. I could talk about that later. A lawyer, an art historian, a sociologist, and me, a data scientist, and the writing group is still going. And we meet every week. We've been through job changes. We've been through books. We've been through, real life issues with our children and our parents, and being on a campus in the middle of the protests last year and this year. And it's been an amazing group, and it's a little bit of Radcliffe that I carry with me.
Thank you.
My name is Kaitlyn Greenidge, and I'm a novelist. So when I was here, I was working on my second novel, which is called Libertie, which is set in 1860s Brooklyn and then 1870s Haiti. So I don't like using the term historical novel, but it's a novel that needs a lot of historical research. So that was what I was really excited to do when I was here, and to really delve into both of those sort of areas of history. I think one of the things about being a novelist is, you can have a plan for a book, but so much of it is just sort of the disparate connections that you make when you're sort of walking back and forth, or something happens to catch your eye and it sort of works its way into a novel. So all of that sort of happened here. In the little film, they had a slide go by about a exhibition that they had in the Radcliffe Center that was around, I forget the name of the artist, but he did a bunch of stuff where it was pressing of irons, like the irons that you use to iron clothes. And so we went to an artist talk on that, and I remember, luckily, another person my year was Tanisha Ford, who is a historian of fashion as it connects to the civil rights movement and Black history in general. And so I remember at that talk, there was sort of like the spontaneous conversation about like clothing and taking care of clothing and how it relates to self. And I remember Tanisha using the word memories, which is like a very old term that seamstresses use, laundresses use to describe ironing clothes. It's like you're taking the memory out of a clothes. And that basically made the whole third chapter of this book, a whole section of this book that was sort of built around that conversation. So even just that alone, outside of sort of all of the personal stuff, was how being here really worked into my work, and made really close friends with some of the artists who were here and some of the historians who were here. And when I was here, the other novelist who was here was Min-Jin Lee. And I do have to say, she on her own sort of took on a mentorship role to me, which I'm really sort of forever grateful for. And it's really something to have a novelist who is, accomplishing things that you hope to accomplish someday, sort of take you for a walk around Harvard Square and say, we're both doing this together. We're both making this magic together. If you ever have the chance to meet Min-Jin, she is, even sort of as hard as she works and as much stuff that she does not take for granted the fact that, writing is a mystery in many ways. And so just to have somebody, a morning after you've spent staring at a page and trying to do something, and your editor from somewhere else is telling you your other piece is late, and, all these other things, and to walk around the square with her, and for her to go back to what we're actually here to do, was really, really special. And she continues to be a friend today, so thank you.
I'm going to request that we don't applaud in between, just because it takes time, and I would love for these guys to have to have as much time as possible for chatting. But thank you. Okay, Sharon, over to you.
Thank you. It's hard not to be in this room and get a little teary-eyed, because I think it was about 9 years ago that we had sort of the opening of my class of Radcliffe Fellows, and I really felt like I'd hit the jackpot. I was the luckiest person in the world, and that feeling lasted the whole 9 months here and has lasted the 9 years since then. And when I think what was it that made me feel so lucky is that as a journalist, in my work, the driving question for me has always been the cross-section of science, technology, and national security, of how does science get conducted when it's sponsored or within the national security state, and what effect does it have on the country and the world? And in journalism, that was always, a little bit odd. People had beats, whether it's in science or national security, and trying to explain to people, well, I'm looking at this cross-section and at these influences of these different factors. People found it interesting, but I didn't necessarily have a community. And when I came to Radcliffe, it was having an instant community of people who were doing exactly that, who were reaching beyond their disciplines to other areas and asking some of those same questions. And then the friendships that I got out of the fellowship, I think, like everyone here, lasted till today. Elliot Kola, a professor of Arabic studies at Georgetown, is still a close friend of mine. We go running every weekend, talking about literature, about politics, about the Middle East. And other of my friends, we had sort of a group of people who would go out to dinner 2 or 3 times a week. An Arabic studies professor, a journalist, a political scientist, a physicist. And I don't know that I ever have the aha moment of what came out of that, but I do know that for all of us, in that group, and I'm sure for other fellows, there are projects that came out of those conversations, ideas, stress testing sort of notions that I still value to this day, and still value those people. So for me, this was just an incredible experience. I came into the fellowship to the question of what we thought we were going to do and what we did. I had a new proposal, but what this fellowship ended up doing is giving me the space to finish the book I was working on, this history of DARPA, the Pentagon agency. And it also got me thinking on what is hopefully going to be my next book, which is where does science go next? And technology in the national security state, which I think is increasingly going towards Silicon Valley. So just being able to think about these ideas, what interests you, and bounce them off colleagues was completely invaluable.
I was a Radcliffe Fellow in 2017 and 18, and I worked in, I'm a visual artist, so I worked on several projects when I was here, but I think I will highlight two of them. The one that was part of my application, which was an object-based installation commenting on the presence of industry in the Amazon forest, specifically in the city of Manaus, which is the capital of the state of Amazonas in Brazil. And I was doing work that was very labor-intensive. For example, repurposing Amazon delivery boxes into weaving woven objects. And so I was, flattening, cutting the boxes in strips and weaving with those strips, and that's a technique that I perfected here and that I keep working and expanding the relationship between the word Amazon for the Amazon forest and Amazon for the e-retail stores, and all the relationships of environmental degradation and consumerism that can be drawn with that displacement of the word. Especially in English, in Portuguese doesn't work that well because we call Amazonas or Amazonia and not Amazon for the e-retail store. So I was working with that. I was making things besides thinking and researching, which is also part of my practice. I was using the ceramics shop that Harvard has a lot, which I thought it was curious because people usually come to Radcliffe to make research and think about things and write books. And I was like, no, I'm making things. I'm an artist. I think I can do that. But I was also in conversation with a lot of my colleagues in different disciplines. And I think after Radcliffe, I felt more comfortable reaching across disciplines, which I've always been a very curious artist or person in relationship to topics that go beyond art. And Radcliffe gave me an environment where I could nurture different kinds of conversation and then feel comfortable doing that afterwards. I'll highlight my friendship and collaboration with composer Michele Agnes Magalhães. I started doing research on what became a film, which took me 4 years to make and was recently at the Whitney Biennial. The title is Before the Volcanoes Sing, and I was looking at pre-Columbian Mayan wind instruments held in museum collections in the US and Guatemala, and I wanted to reanimate them, bring them to life, as opposed to keeping them as dead objects, dead instruments in museum collections. Obviously, I did not get authorization from museums to play those instruments, but I collaborated with archaeologist Jared Katz, who's now at the MFA Boston, the music curator there, and with him we 3D scanned and 3D printed replicas in ceramics from some of those flutes that then with Michele Agnes Magalhães we develop scores for them that became a film that also had a component that was more documentary filmmaking with Guatemalan Mayan composer Rosa Chavez in Guatemala and Ixil Maya painter Torreo Fidel Brito Bernal in Riverside. So you see, it's like, I think it is in my practice to collaborate with people and bring people into my projects, and Radcliffe was certainly a moment where I was able to reach across disciplines. I was also in conversation with marine biologists, talking a lot about the environment, and that's something that is very much in my practice up to this day.
So I'm really looking forward to my fellowship year. And just I'll just give a little bit of context for what I want to do that year and why. So my background is I'm returned to Harvard last year after 23 years. I received my PhD here in American Civilization, and now it's American Studies in my law degree. And I have been, I guess, an interdisciplinary scholar, but maybe it's better phrased as someone who uses multiple disciplines to ask questions. So every book that I write, and really every article, begins with a question, and I try to I answer it using all of the bibliographies, but also the methods that are at my disposal. So, for example, when I wrote a history of the song that's called the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, I asked the question, why is this song still resonant 100 years after it's been written and used? Newspapers and memoir and music scholarship, et cetera, right? So I am hoping to use next year to work on a project that's related to my dissertation, which wasn't published, which is sort of an exploration of what I'm calling African American jurisprudence, and which is, the question is sort of begins with, as a riff on the famous Frederick Douglass speech of 1852, where he says, what to the slave is the 4th of July? The question is, what to the slave is the law? And so how to trace an answer to this question, what does it mean to think about what the law is and should be from out of a tradition of people who were defined as outside the law. And so what I'm hoping is that in order to answer that question in a way that is narratively compelling, that being in conversation with people from multiple fields, trying to figure out a way to tell that story through stories, and not just through theory, will be facilitated by being in this rich, robust, complex community.
Thank you all so much. Imani, what you were just saying, I feel so many questions that I think pertain to everyone here. One of them, maybe to start, and then I'll come to another, but is about, in the little film, one of the lines was, Radcliffe is a place where people ask hard questions. And I wanted to sort of throw that out to you guys and ask what that means to you as a place. Is it a place of risk, of safety, of complication, of what does that mean, and how and what are the sorts? I mean, you've raised there a hard question, right? And maybe for everybody else also to just might have something to say about what some of the hard questions are that you're approaching in your work. Would you like to start?
Okay, sure. I think all of the questions are hard, in part because what I have found consistently is that we have all of these wonderful methods that are coming from multiple disciplines, and yet much of what I'm interested in falls in the cracks between the way disciplines ask questions. So, and this is not the best example, but it is. And so my last book, which was both a kind of physical movement through the South, but also a historical kind of inquiry into the region to understand why it is at once so endlessly fascinating and also so endlessly demonized. And so in this society is one of the, so I had this riff where I'm talking about all of the ways that, all of the sugar that comes out of the South, like all of the major sodas that everybody likes, they're all started in the South. And even, well, I won't, but Mountain Dew is actually a name that's a riff on moonshine. And it's now the most sugary soda, which is also addictive in its own. But what I wanted to, so I'm doing all of this inquiry into that sort of addictive impact of sugars and the like. But what I really want to understand is why my grandmother used to say, put some more sugar on your cereal, baby, every morning. And what she was doing was actually trying to find a way to offer some sweetness in what is often a hard scrabble life, right? So how to try to tell that story, but to capture its connection to economic inequality, histories of race and racialization and Jim Crow and all of those sorts of. So it is, for me, the hard questions are often how to get at that spot in between the academic inquiry to get to sort of, it's the emotional, but it's also a deeply intellectual kind of question. So, so all the questions are hard. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Sure, I mean, I think when, with like an artistic project, oftentimes the point is that like you're asking a question that doesn't have an answer, that could have multiple answers at once. And so, you know, like a space like this, there's a million different ways that you could try and answer a question or sort of like solve a question or get to something. I remember when I was working on the book here, like the overarching question for me was like, is there in the United States, can we come up with a definition of freedom that's not about domination? Like, can you measure freedom without saying what you can get away with doing to another person without repercussions? And what would that look like, especially for the character in this book, to come up with a definition of freedom that doesn't exist in any of those contexts and come up with it living in a time period where everything is sort of about domination when you're in the 1860s and 1870s, US and Haiti. So there's no real, there's a million different answers to what that could look like, and there's a million different contradictions about what that could be and how you could embody that. But for me, like, that was what was really wonderful about this space, was to have the time to follow all of those different path routes and routes to figure out what all of those things could look like or what that could be.
Thank you.
I think I'll use the example of my latest film. That was a project that started here. I think the big question there, so I mentioned the flutes, but that film is part of a body of work that looks at Mayan revival architecture. Before the Volcano Sing, specifically the work of Frank Lloyd Wright in California during the 1920s and 30s, where he was very much looking at pre-Columbian structures, Mayan temples, and so on, and taking inspiration from those buildings, but not really acknowledging it openly. So those buildings are seen as a result of appropriating culture, right? But they are all Los Angeles landmarks and protected buildings and so on and so forth. So my question was like, how can we put those buildings in a genealogy of buildings that goes back to pre-Columbian structures, acknowledge that in the first place, and start writing new histories for that. So a big question for me was like, how do I work across culture, collaborating with contemporary Mayan artists, who two of them I mentioned here, Rosa Chavez and Tohil Fidel Brito Bernal, are featuring the film, right? So how can we respectively collaborate across culture, going beyond our subject position and not being limited by that, but doing that as an act of collective creation or rewriting histories that go, again, beyond given subject positions, because I am not Mayan, right? I did my DNA test a few months ago, and I found out that I have like 4% of indigenous Brazilian or like from South American indigenous in my blood. So it's like, I think most of us have like different cultural and genetic combinations in who we are and how we can operate in culture collectively respecting and engaging with all these facets of who we are. Giving voice to multiple histories and et cetera, et cetera. So they are very, for me, very difficult questions that I'm still, expanding in my work in different ways. But I hope it made sense.
So I think the hardest part, I think for most people, at least for me, is trying to, what is the question that you're trying to answer? That trying to come up with that question, is it an interesting question? And if you can answer it, is it actually important? And there's a lot of questions that you end up toying with that even if you could answer it, first of all, it may not be answerable. And if you could answer it, maybe it's not that important. And that's where I think the interdisciplinary part is helpful, having colleagues say, like, is that an interesting question? Would you want to know the answer? One of the things I'm struggling with now, the last book I did, which I finished here, was looking at that question of what made one military agency successful, and then what are the implications of that success? The question I'm looking at now is, what does it mean when you have the focus of your military science and technology base shift into Silicon Valley? Why is that happening, and what are the implications of it? But it's still, part of that, it's a very hard question because we're at the beginning part of that process right now and not at the end. But that's always the hardest part for me, is coming up with the initial question.
So Radcliffe is a great place to ask big questions. And for me, the experience was really supported by the resources here, which was both time and colleagues and infrastructure. And so for me, the big questions really have to do with, how do we thrive in a technological world? What strategies can we use to reduce the risk of the technologies we deal with every day, and that certainly includes AI, and promote the benefits? What do you do if you're not Elon Musk, or not the owner of TikTok, or not part of the European Parliament? What can you do? What can I do? And that turned out to be really the seed of the book that I'm now writing, halfway through, on the basis of my Radcliffe Fellowship, to really explore what are the kinds of strategies that citizens and professionals and all of us can do to try to ratchet down the level of risk. And for me, I've had the most fabulous guides, so I hope you don't mind, give me a little moment to mention them. In my writing group, Radcliffe Fellow and Igone just published a book on disruptive fashion in the French Revolution, which is a fantastic book. Anne's at Barnard, and Anne was a Radcliffe Fellow. Another one of my writing group is Liz Chiarello, who has just published a book, actually probably about a month ago, on policing patients, which looks at the opioid crisis and what different groups, police and patients and pharmacists and physicians, do, how they interact with each other. Another one of us, Alexi Lahav, has been writing in the scholarly literature. She's a lawyer. She talks about tort law. And when you're in a writing group with people like that, they're always asking you questions about, what's the fundamental impact of this technology in my world? What do I do about that? I'm a lawyer. What do I do about that? I'm a sociologist. What do I do about that? And they also bring to you incredible insights about, here's how historians look at it. Here's how sociologists look at it. So I would say that when you have big questions, you're trying to come up with at least medium-sized, if not big, solutions. And this wealth of input from interdisciplinary input is just really important. Because if I just talk to computer scientists, I know the kind of answer I'm going to get. And it's not the kind of answer that's going to really help things. Don't tell anyone I said that.
Thank you. As each of you is speaking, I'm thinking about we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and Fran, you mentioned that you're writing a book for a different audience now, and I wondered, I always say to my students, my undergraduate students, every fiction writer is there's a spectrum between Fun with Dick and Jane and Finnegan's Wake. And each of us is situating ourselves somewhere along the spectrum between Fun with Dick and Jane and Finnegan's Wake. And every step you take towards Finnegan's Wake, you gain in nuance and sophistication, and you lose readers. So I'm just wondering for you guys how that question of audience. Our panel title is about stirring the public imagination, and I'm wondering how that question of audience comes into it for you with the work that you do, or if there are different audiences for different works that you're working on.
Did you want me to go on with what I told you?
Sure, yes.
So one of the really cool things about our year is that we formed these small groups. We had a 101 group where I explained data science to musicologists, and mathematicians explained math to the rest of us, and we did all this great stuff. One of the groups we did was a writing group. And in our year, Jill Lepore was also a fellow. So Jill came to our writing group, and she talked about creative nonfiction and the fact that she's juggling an amazing number of things, and her writing is beyond belief in terms of prestige and just wonderfulness. And it was interesting to me because as a computer scientist, not that many computer scientists write books. We're typically writing articles and reports and those kinds of things. And it hadn't really occurred to me before Radcliffe to write a book, for that to be the right format for the things I wanted to say. But after talking with Jill and everybody else in my year and then with the writing group, it was really clear that what I wanted to say was sort of book-sized. It wasn't article-sized, it wasn't op-ed sized, it was book-sized. And one of the great things about Radcliffe is not only did that opportunity come up, but I also got a lot of sort of experience from experts in how one goes about that. So it was one of the wonderful opportunities that I hadn't imagined when I came to the fellowship.
Wait, Sharon.
I guess on the question of audience, as someone who does narrative nonfiction, what you always dream of, is that your writing connects with such a large audience. But I don't think trying to, part of what was so wonderful about Radcliffe is there are the topics that I'm interested in, and not all of them do I think are instantly going to connect to a wide audience. But what you hope is that if you find it fascinating, and if you can elevate it, that you connect with that wider audience rather than trying to adjust it. And I actually have a funny Jill Lepore story. I think it was a year or two after Radcliffe that I started work on a book proposal about a MIT professor from the 1960s, 1970s named Ithiel Poole that had kind of fallen out. Like, nobody has heard of him. And a couple months into the book proposal, I did an interview with someone who said, funny, I just did an interview with Jill Lepore. And so I asked my agent what to do. I said, she's working on the same book. And my agent said, just write her. I didn't know her. And I wrote her, and she said, yes, indeed, I've been working on a book proposal. And of course, it was disappointing for me, but it was actually lovely to know that someone who was relatively, this professor, sort of obscure in the modern context, that it appealed to someone else in that same way. I think if you stay true to the questions that interest you, they may connect with a wider audience, they may not, but I think trying to adjust your interest to capture the wider audience, I don't think that works out well, at least not for me.
She was writing that book during our fellowship.
Yeah. I think maybe this is the time that I reveal that, Claire, you were my teacher for a long time ago when I was in grad school.
She was brilliant then.
And also that program teaching was the novelist Peter Carey, who always used to like to say to us, a novel is just a big book of ideas. That's all it is. It's just a book where you're just flitting from idea to idea, and you hopefully weave them all together, sort of like, the grab bag as the idea of how you make a book. And that's always very, very, very appealing to me, because one of the reasons why I became a novelist is that I thought for a long time I was going to be a historian. I worked for a long time in museums around public history, but I would always find these stories in the archives that were so interesting and wonderful, and I would start making stories around them. And I knew that they were sort of like one-off stories that weren't really something that you could write an article around or a book around. Like I remember I was doing this research where I was reading all of these gossip columns in Black newspapers in New York in the 1920s and 30s, and there's this one woman who keeps appearing in every column. She would, according to the gossip column, she would purposefully undress in front of her window in Bed-Stuy every day, and people would walk by. She was like known in the neighborhood. I thought, I just want to write about her. I just want to write a whole book about her and why she does this and what she's doing and who is she. But she's just in a gossip. You can't, as a historian, if somebody had given me Saidiya Hartman 20 years ago, probably I would still be a historian, but I hadn't read her yet. So I didn't know how to sort of do that. And so a big part of becoming a novelist was to bring sort of these stories and questions that I was interested in to a slightly larger audience and sort of like figure that part of it out.
So one of the, I am really captivated by going into different kinds of forms. So I love long form journalism type pieces and essays and books on different topics and photo criticism and film criticism. So it is, so I guess those implicitly have varying audiences, and yet also I try to think of what I write as always an invitation to any reader, which means that part of the exercise is trying to make complex ideas clear. And that exercise actually, I think, allows me to get a better grasp on the ideas, in fact, so that it's both, what I'm writing is both engaging to someone who knows something about the field, but also to someone who has no idea, they can still enter into the conversation. So I guess I think about audience in that way, right? There's an implicit audience. Not everybody is going to, read a catalog essay for a fine art photographer. Not everybody is going to read a work of gender theory, right? But I want to write in such a way that everybody who's interested in those things potentially can have access to the conversation.
Well, as an artist, an interdisciplinary artist or multidisciplinary, I work across formats, right? So it's like a film, the one that I had at Whitney in Biennia was an hour. So a time-based work requires a certain level of engagement, and the audience will interact with it in different ways, right? There isn't a way for me to really make sure that the film will be seen in its entirety in an exhibition format. For the With Biennial, we did have the film online, so people could stream, and that open up a different kind of audience that maybe wouldn't go to the museum or wouldn't stay in the museum for that long. When I work with sculptures, for example, I have the series of silicon casts of dead trees, and they look very bodily. So the experience that we as human beings have of seeing this other body in the room is very phenomenological, and I think it's more like a gut feeling. That's what you will have with the work, and perhaps intellectualizing it will come after. And so on and so forth. So it's like, it really depends on, because they change materials all the time, and format. I think the way one encounters the work will be very different. But also in terms of audience, depending on, the audience comes with the institution sometimes where the work is being shown, and it varies in that way. And it's interesting then to see how the work is received. So I do not change the way I'm doing the work thinking about the audience, because I assume that my audience, that in the lifetime of a work, the audience will vary constantly. It's more what is the best way to give life to this idea or question that I have.
Thank you all. I wanted to ask another sort of open related question, which has come up thematically, in some of the conversations so far, which is, I think of there's a wonderful Nabokov line where he says, you need the imagination of a scientist and the precision of a poet, right? Which is sort of not the way around that you think he would say it, but makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to ask you, each of you, about the role of imagination in the work that you do, even when the work is the most fact-based, concrete. But for each of you, as a visual or storytellers, visual artists, or visual or verbal storytellers, in varying disciplines, the imagination is surely central. No matter the form. So I wanted to ask that question. Who would like to go first? Fran, are you ready to go? Sorry.
So that was actually the mind-boggling part of Jill's talk with us. It was all informal, and she was talking about how through a lot of her career, she was juggling work and baby, and, she was context switching very effectively, which, all of us could do. But one of the things she talked about, in scholarly writing, I'm going to get this kind of wrong, and apologies to all of my colleagues, but scholarly writing is often stuff that they pay you to read. You start out, at least in science, here's the problem, here's all the things other people did, but they weren't as good as the thing that I'm doing. Here's my method, here's my results. Have I mentioned how smart I am? And so it's typically that's the template of what you're reading. And but Jill is writing for a smart general audience, and especially in her work in The New Yorker. And you're not going to get very far with that, and you're certainly not going to get very far with making your audience feel dumb. And so Jill was talking about, you have to bury your point in an interesting character and an interesting story. I woke up at night and heard a noise that I didn't know where it was coming from, and I looked outside. And you want to keep reading, what happened? And maybe she's talking about the Higgs boson, who knows? But somehow it kind of carries you through. And that had a big impact, that notion of storytelling and characters had a big impact on my own writing. And people had always said, I want to hear it in your voice, not just science voice. And so the book has given me an opportunity to try to bring in more stories. How does technology impact people? What does it mean for our lives? And then how can I kind of underneath get on my own points of we lower the risk by thinking of it more as critical infrastructure, which is not very appealing when you say it, but when you try to kind of pull it through a book, it's a much different thing. So I think that storytelling and the characters, you have to grab your reader and make them want to keep reading, no matter what you're writing. And so that experience was really important to me.
So when I was starting to work on Libertie, it was 2016. I wrote a proposal for the novel in May 2016, I want to say. So I was working on it all through Trump's first election and presidency. For me, what became super important, and the novel's set in Reconstruction era America, so A lot of parallels, a lot of real resonances. So what I came back to again and again was this Alice Walker quote where she talks about that it is radical to give a Black woman character in America a happy ending. So the craft challenge to myself was to give the book a happy ending that emotionally made sense, which was very difficult. And so that's where the active imagination came in. So it was a lot of work about sort of like what does that actually mean to give a character a quote unquote happy ending that's not, there's another Toni Morrison quote where she talks about her characters always being winners. And she says, it's not that they got the big job or they got the car, it's that they know something about themselves that they didn't know before. So all of that sort of came into the question of imagination, of imagining this woman's consciousness of what a quote-unquote happy ending would look like for this person.
So I often say I'm jealous of poets because the question of fact or fiction is not doesn't matter for them, right? What they can, it's the work of the imagination, But I've recently been trying to sort of figure out a way to articulate how I think imagination works in both scholarship and nonfiction. And by that I mean, so the details or the bibliography of a field, those are the sort of, that's the material given, right? That's the constraint. And then figuring out how to put it together is where the imagination enters, and to put it together in such a way that you can tell a story, because if we want our work to resonate, you have to tell a story, because that's how the human mind works, right? We remember stories, is the work of the imagination. And then also, what's sort of, for me, the undercurrent of all of the work is getting closer to, the reason behind all of it is, right, so getting closer to a just and good world, right? And to that absolutely requires the imagination, right, to get us towards something that we have not yet fully seen. So it's always there, but it's there within some structural constraints, which I think actually winds up being an interesting kind of intellectual endeavor. It's like, it's this constant puzzle that you're kind of iterating to get to some kind of artifact that you hope will be useful.
Yeah, well, imagination for me is everything, right? Without, I think what I can offer here is that I also do some research to do my work, but then I have to do that extra lip, there is like the imagination. Where do I go with this? Because it's not just a scientific or scholarly inquiry, that I always feel that there is certain parameters on the output that you will have, a certain responsibility with facts and information. As an artist, the truth is we don't have any of that, right? It can be all fiction, it can be all fantasy, it can be all imagination. Of course that in my work I do have I want to have some social responsibilities with things that I'm putting out into the world. But technically, for the field of art, you don't have as much that constraint, right? You are expected to actually process what you are using as a reference or research for your work into something else.
I guess I look at the imagination part as two different areas. I mean, as a journalist, imagination is not making things up, but we're storytelling, we're narrative driven, we're character driven. I think that we're very good at finding characters and colorful stories. Where we sometimes struggle, and I think that's a big part of the imagination problem, is it goes back to the question, like what question are we trying to answer? I'm going to slightly embarrass my colleague Tina here from my year in the Radcliffe Fellow. I remember talking to her about her project, looking at the neuroscience of consumption and how that can affect environmental change. I'm like, what a huge question. Like a journalist, I think, would rarely think of that. We tend to problematize issues. We're rarely thinking about solutions. But the imagination to think about those big problems and the solutions, I think that, at least for me, is the harder part, and a lot of also some of what I learned out of Radcliffe.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last quick question before we move to audience questions. We'll be with you guys, your questions in just a moment. As you're speaking, another thing that I always think, as each of you speaking, has come to mind, which is that everything is a balance of freedom and constraint, right? We're all wearing clothes. We all agreed somehow, right? So that it seems as though there's this undercurrent in our conversation today about the interdisciplinary nature of Radcliffe, about the types of conversations that happen here, about an ensuing hybridity of forums that seems for many people to emerge, and in a way, Sharon, when you're talking about Tina's project, right? Thank you, Tina. It's about projecting into a future, which is something I think, Imani, you're also speaking about, and so that question of how to be productively revolutionary, as it were, or productively future-oriented, and is that something that you envisioning a future that could answer some of the solutions? Is that something that you guys are thinking about in your work?
Yes.
Yes, Imani says yes.
Do you wanna go? Oh, I thought you were looking at me. I think, as you say that, there's probably lots of different answers to that, but I think about trying to do what we are able to do at Radcliffe in our regularly overscheduled lives. And most of us work in sectors or institutions in which, there's a somewhat stratified way of being successful. And typically, for myself in academia, being interdisciplinary is really exciting, but makes it hard, for example, for junior people to get tenure, right? You have to excel in at least one discipline, and that has to be recognizable enough for you to get over that line. And so there's things we say we want to be doing, but the infrastructure that we actually live in sometimes creates roadblocks. The amazing thing about the Radcliffe year for myself, and I think probably for everybody, is that world you want to be living with is the world that you get to live with in that year. There are so many accomplished people. I think everyone I talked to in my year, kind of, including me, got there and thought, how the heck did I get here? It's like, why me? I think all of us just felt we were surrounded by this wealth of accomplishment and generosity and big-heartedness and all of that. But I think then we go back to our regular day jobs, and it's harder because we like interdisciplinary, we don't know how to deal with it in traditional academic structures. But it also sort of gives you some wherewithal and some creds in order to try to push against the system. And I think a lot of us have tried to push against the system with more or less and sometimes much more success. So that's a good thing.
I will answer this question a little tangentially. I just want to thank all the scholars who were open to talk with me throughout the years, because yes, I want to be part of the revolution. No, I don't know how to do that. Every time there is a new work, a new question, I try to pursue something different, but is perhaps because people on the other side are open to engage with my questions, that we can make attempts in that direction. And without the openness from scholars in different fields, and I collaborated with art historians in the field of Mayan archaeology and art history, with NASA space scientists, with environmentalists and so on and so forth, like different fields, music composer, as I said before, and without the openness from people on other fields to do that, I wouldn't have done the work that I've done so far. So this is just a public thank you to all of you that are there, and hopefully many other people that I'll be able to collaborate in the future, collaborate with.
So I wanted to say something because of what you just said, and I've been thinking about, a couple of months ago I did an interview of a man who is the big chief of one of the Mardi Gras Indian crews in New Orleans, and of the young Seminole hunters. And he makes, and part of the reason I wanted to talk to him is he does these sort of historic scenes in these incredibly beautiful, large costumes that they use for marching in Mardi Gras. And he was talking to me about the process of making these enormous, stunning works of art by sewing 1 and 2 millimeter beads one by one. And he was talking about doing it in the context of the hurricanes. So working at times for 18 hours a day with no lights, no fresh water, having to go out and get water. And it's, of course, it's incredibly inspiring, but it was also this, the conversation with that artist became this sort of realization that actually is what it means to do the work. It is the slow, diligent labor, and yet also being able to envision, the big piece in the future that will change based upon the conditions of one's life, right? And so I think there's something about, so in that sort of, couple of hours of collaboration, it was this incredible reckoning for me to sort of be like, okay, to actually be attentive to the little bits of work that move us forward. Yeah, so it's sort of the other side of that point,
So beautiful. Thank you.
Imani, I wrote a short story about that a million years ago about it's about a woman who, her husband is like a New Orleans local celebrity. He dies, and she makes a wax effigy of his body to take to the bars with her to drink with her. But there's a whole part where somebody, where somebody is doing that, and I always found that labor so fascinating. And then I will say to your question, Claire, for me, a big part of thinking about the future is releasing control over it. There is no control over any of it. And, I think back to my Radcliffe year when I was working on that book, and I got pregnant and didn't really know or thought I knew that that book was going to come out and that book came out in spring 2021. So I definitely could not have predicted anything about what that world was going to look like when that book was released. And so, there's only so much you can sort of do. It really is that really small thing that you can control in the current moment. And one of the things, it's very easy to forget that, because I think we live in a world where, you're constantly being asked to think either in the future or in the past. You're very rarely being asked to just be in the current moment, which is why spaces of contemplation are so important and special, and you have to really actually protect them many, many times. So that's, to bring it back around to this, that's always, I was sitting here and sort of looking out here and remembering being in the audience for all of these talks and how present you have to really be listening to what other people are saying and really take in what other people are saying about their research, and how rare that is in your adult life to really have long stretches of time where that's all you have to do. That's all you're being expected to do.
Incredible gift. Did you want to add anything, Sharon?
My colleagues were so fascinating, I forgot the original question.
It was about the future and project the big question. how the combination of sort of conversation, interdisciplinarity, hybridity, and looking to a future. Maybe that just seems too big a question to answer. I don't
Well, I'll take a part of that, which is I think, I think you made a good point that you go back after Radcliffe to the original constraints you were under. And I guess I look at myself as sort of like flying the flag for interdisciplinary. Certainly in my job now, I try to get the different parts to talk to each other, to try to get others interested in those same issues that interested me. And I think that's part of what Radcliffe should be, trying to take some of the lessons we learned back to our institutions. It's imperfect because people have the reward systems they have, but we can at least try.
Thank you, thank you. So now we'll turn to the questions. The questions that we have here from the audience. So here's a question for the previous fellows on the panel. What were you most surprised that other fellows did not understand at first about your own discipline? That's a great question. Any takers?
I guess I was surprised. My fellow fellows were pretty savvy, I have to say, and everybody uses technology these days, but often people sort of think about the technology world like Jurassic Park, right? There's these giant companies and they go around conking each other over the head, and there's so much subtlety in terms of the way you design things, you develop things, you write laws about things, you manage things. There's a whole human ecosystem in which technology is embedded, and the way you turn those dials in the ecosystem really has a lot to do with how you experience it and what the outcomes were. And so that was a great opportunity for me to learn how to explain about that ecosystem to my fellow fellows, and to explain the subtlety of that.
Anybody else want to? I would just mention, this is not about me, but when I was it is about me. I was a fellow. There was a brilliant mathematician from France, and the talks, of course, are intended to be accessible to all comers, including those who haven't taken calculus. And I did not raise my hand, although I might have. And somebody raised a hand, and that professor said, "My 8-year-old would understand this." Right? So yes. So I think sometimes people are surprised by what people don't understand. Just saying. Okay. Did you engage with students during your fellowship, and how did their beginner's mind shape your work? Did any?
I can address that, because I had I think at one point I had the I forget what it's called, the research partners. I assume this is still part of Radcliffe. So I initially had 3, and then at one point went up to 5, under guessing correctly that there would be 1 or 2 that would fade away, that their semesters would get busy. There might be one who just didn't, would try to do the project work, but might not. But my hope was, I dedicated time to them. I mean, it wasn't just I wanted to make sure they got something out of it. And then I also correctly predicted 1 to 2 would be stellar, and in fact, that's what I had. 1 to 2 faded away. 1 tried, and I hope that partner got something out of the research, and then a couple, one, we were still very much in touch for years afterwards, just did incredible research, in fact, ended up taking sort of an adjacent part of some research he did for my book that was only pretty much a footnote, and did his whole, I think, his senior thesis on it. I found it to be an incredible experience. First of all, it was just valuable. They did a lot of the fact-checking for my book, sometimes finding mistakes in the original. If I cited a secondary source, they would go back to the primary source and find mistakes. So they were invaluable on that. And then just the way they interacted with the materials, the questions they asked, the research routes that they went from what they did. I thought for me, I know that not everybody took advantage of it. Some people, it just wasn't part of their world. I thought that was an incredible, wonderful experience, and I certainly hope it was for the students as well.
Thank you. Thank you. What was the single most unexpected conversation you had at Radcliffe? And how, if it did it change your thinking? That's a great question. Well, you have stumped our brilliant panel. There are too many conversations? Does one stick out?
I can say one of a fellow who I became really close with was visual artist Jatovia Gary, who was here when I was here, and she and I would walk around the Commons. She also liked to work late at night in the office, so we were both usually here at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, just being, putting in hours or just wandering around. And so we would walk around the Common a lot, and we would talk a lot about the history of Cambridge and the history of Black people in Cambridge, and just those general kind of conversations were really wonderful because Jatovia is from Texas originally, and so we're talking about sort of like the culture shock of coming from Texas, and she had been in Paris doing work before then, and then coming here. So those conversations were really wonderful.
Thank you. Anybody else want to? Okay. Do you fellows ever engage in transdisciplinary, collaborative, blue sky thinking to identify questions that need to be asked but are not as yet? What's blue sky thinking? Looking up.
Like blue sky, like
Every day.
Far.
Fellows do that every day at Radcliffe.
Fellows do that every day at Radcliffe. Every day.
Yeah.
Okay. Reflecting on a dearth of active mentors in my life, I wonder how you seek out mentorship invited into your life and take initiative to nurture it. So, and maybe for some of you that's being mentors, whether you seek out the role of being a mentor, or if earlier in your life, mentors. I mean, I'm thinking, Kaitlyn, of you speaking of the conversations with with Min-Jin Lee,
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky that Min-Jin took the initiative of that one. But in general, I think for me, I've been really lucky and blessed to have strong relationships with mentors moving forward, and a lot of it has just been really pestering people and bugging people until they sort of respond. I'm like, when I was an undergrad, my writing professor, the very last semester I was there, was the writer Alexander Chi, and I remember not really knowing much, thinking wanting to be a writer, but also just not wanting to call myself a writer at that point. But just being like, if I can just stay close to Alex, something will happen. So let me just stay around this person and not tell them don't ever say I want to be a writer to this person. Not even talk to them about books, just kind of circle around. And that seemed to have worked out at the time, so yeah.
Well, I think that sense of possibility, right, is so important. Just to know that there are people who have walked the path and are walking the path alongside or in front of you. It's so important to feel that it's possible. Yeah. Okay. What are the difficulties you encountered in your year? And how did you deal with the good fortune of being at Radcliffe amid the devastation in the world? That's a big question, but it is also true. It is an amazing place, but it is not the wider world.
It would be interesting to hear folks who went through the last year when all of our campuses were kind of going crazy with protests and those kinds of things. But in my year, we were the first pandemic year, which is to say that all of us arrived bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in September, and then in March, Harvard closed down, and a shout out to the Radcliffe folks, because it was incredibly hard to deal with for all of us. What were they supposed to do with all of these fellows? What were we supposed to do? You had fellows who could just drive home, and that was traumatic enough. I was one of those. But you had fellows that lived in other countries. Some of them were scholars at risk. Airports were closing. They had families and school systems. And so that was a really difficult thing for the fellowship to go through. And what came out of that is our year actually continued by Zoom. It's never enough. It's weird to meet people in cyberspace. Let's just, be frank about that. But it was better than nothing, and actually my writing group kind of came out of that. Everything has a silver lining of some sort, although sometimes it's hard to see what it is. But I would say that, the fellowship was resilient, both the fellows and Radcliffe and everybody who participated. Stuff happens in life, and that was a really, really difficult thing, I think, for everybody. So shout out to Radcliffe, because that was really hard.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think for me, it's like the fellowship was such an amazing protected space where you can go deep into, obviously, your research, the questions that you are working through. But then it's also interesting to remember that there is a whole world out there, right? And I think during the fellowship, it is this gestation moment where you are protected, and it's obviously amazing to have that, but bringing the work out into the world or making those connections afterwards, if not during, I think it's where a lot of the value is, because it is necessary almost to be a little removed from certain things, I think, to be able to go and think deeply, and that's, I think, what all of us cherish about that moment, to have that protected space. But then also, you have to be critical about those boundaries, maybe.
This isn't a devastation necessarily, but I became pregnant when I was at Radcliffe. It was my first pregnancy, and the year before I had been at Radcliffe, I had quit my full-time job. So it was my first time just living off of writing alone, and I was adjuncting and freelancing and sort of like, working 5 things at once to bring stuff together. So when I got pregnant at Radcliffe, I read a lot about pregnancy, and I'd had friends who were pregnant, but I didn't understand that the first semester you're just so tired. I didn't know that part of it. And so I don't know that I would have had the wherewithal or time to just have the time to just feel that and still have, 1 to 2 hours to do work in the morning and then just sit there and, gestate for the rest of the day. And so for that, I'm, very, very grateful, because I was not anticipating that when all that started.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? I'm wondering, maybe we have just a couple of minutes, and maybe one person or 2 people might have an answer to, again, a future-looking question. What do you hope the world looks like at Radcliffe's 50th anniversary? Seems a good spot to land. Any takers? Well, I'm going to say, I hope we're all still, I mean, I may not be here, but I hope to be here. Heck, I could be here. But I hope we're all still gathering in rooms in person, embodied. That's my hope, is that whatever wonderful, amazing advances there are in the world, that we are still leading our in-person lives and having such amazing conversations as you guys have shared with us today. So thank you all so much. A big hand of applause for And I'm to make a small announcement, which is we are now going to take a break, and then afterwards we will have a 15-minute break, and then reconvene for a reading by the most amazing Tracy K. Smith. So enjoy the small break and see you shortly. Thank you, everybody.